Hello everyone, welcome to the third presentation of AOE's fall webinar series. My name is Tony Mold and I'm the Learning and Development Coordinator at AOE. We're glad that you could join us. As usual, we'd like to start with some useful instructions. During the presentation, you will be asked to participate in some polls. You can select the answer directly in the pop-up window which will appear on your screen. You may ask questions using the chat box. Our speaker will be happy to address questions at the end of the presentation. The recording will be made available after the live presentation. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar. Kimberly Kahlers is the president of AOE, a full-service association management and marketing consulting firm, headquartered in Farmington Hills, Michigan. In addition to her professional activities, Kimberly is a yoga teacher. She also owns and manages a yoga teachers training school accredited through the Yoga Alliance. Her presentation on corporate mindfulness is an outgrowth of her corporate and yoga experience and training. Welcome, Kimberly.
Fantastic. Thank you for that introduction, Tony, and welcome to everyone that's in attendance today. Today is coincidentally World Kindness Day that I saw a couple of hours ago, and I think this is a great topic. I'd like to say I planned this session for this day. It's also Wear a Cardigan Day in honor of Mr. Rogers. So lots of great thoughts as we dive into the mindfulness topic. This presentation is an outgrowth of my business experience as well as my training as a yoga teacher and in mindfulness. And I hope that it's something that you can incorporate into all aspects of your life. So we're going to go ahead and get started talking about corporate mindfulness. And the first thing I want to chat about is just that our connection to technology has taken over. It's in every aspect of our life, and it's one of the reasons that we find mindfulness so prevalent in our conversations in business sectors today. We're no longer bored, and this has actually become an issue. There's a lot of studies that are being done in schools in terms of bringing brainstorming and boredom back for our children. We used to go outside and play, and we had time to be bored, and there's actually a really wonderful creative process that happens, and in terms of how our brain thinks. And we no longer, as a human race, are bored all that often. So I'm actually going to ask Tony to launch our first poll, which relates to what we do when you find yourself waiting in line. So I'm interested to know what you do these days when you wait in line. Go ahead and launch the poll, Tony. So your options here, maybe you pull your phone out and check social media, you act impatient, use the time to take a breath and look around, or talk to a stranger. And it's really timely to ask about this as we're entering into the holiday season, and we'll all be standing on a lot of lines probably, or maybe not. Maybe we'll be shopping all online. I'm going to give it just a couple more seconds. And let's go ahead and we'll close the poll now. So 50% of you noted that you pull your phone out and check social media. Thank you for being honest. I appreciate that. It's probably what I would have put as well. 0% of you said that you act impatient, which is really interesting and great. 44% of you use the time to take a breath and look around. And what an amazing answer that is. And I hope that, at the end of this presentation that you're inspired to do that a little bit more. And then 6% of you noted that you talk to a stranger. And I think that's awesome too. That's something that we don't do very often. We can tend to be very antisocial as we, move through with our connection to technology. Thank you for that. So connection to technology has taken over. We're no longer bored. And how do we continue to move forward? So whenever there's a moment to pause in today's society, we tend to pull out our cell phones in most cases or some form of technology. Not a problem, right? I hear often that, it's not an issue because I'm really, really good at multitasking. Studies actually show that our brains do have a challenge when we multitask. But I'm going to launch a poll here in a minute just to find out a little bit more about what your viewpoint on multitasking is. So, Tony, go ahead and launch the next poll. How many of you consider yourself a good multitasker? And don't worry, we've got 2 polls right off the bat, and then I'm going to slow down on the polls here. So, options here: no, I'm really good at it, I can do 12 things at once. No, I'm terrible at it. And then 13% of you so far are saying that you're not sure. I'll give it just a couple more seconds to weigh in. And we'll go ahead and close the poll at this point. Thank you, Tony. So 40% of you said, yeah, you're really great at multitasking. You can do many things at once. 45% of you said, no, I'm terrible at it. 15% of you said that you're not sure. So we're going to talk a little bit more about multitasking because we are a generation, a society of multitaskers right now. And studies actually show that our brains don't want us to multitask. It leaves us tired, sluggish, cranky, and quick to react, and could even be worrisome. Is this a familiar feeling? Time, money, work, all of the things that are pulling us in many different directions. We're going to do a quick exercise here just to test how good of a multitasker you are. And I typically give this presentation in person, so I'm going to do my best to try and handle this from a webinar standpoint. But we are going to test your multitasking skills. This is something fun that you can do with others as well. Grab a piece of paper real quick and pen or pencil. I'll give you a couple of seconds to locate that. And then what we're going to do is 2 different exercises. The first one is you're simply going to write down, I am a great multitasker. So write that out, the letters and the words you find here, I am a great multitasker. And then right after that, you're going to write the numbers 1 through 20. So I'll go ahead and give you a time to go ahead and start in just a second. I'm actually going to use a timer. So no cheating yet. Give you a countdown for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Go ahead and start. Again, I am a great multitasker. And then writing right after that the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up until 20. We're at 15 seconds. We're at 25. And we're at 30. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this part of the exercise at this time. Typically when I do this in person, it takes anywhere from 20 to 30 seconds for this first part. Now again, no cheating. We're going to do this one more time, but to test your multitasking skills, you're going to go back and forth between the letters and the numbers. So you're going to write I, the number 1, A, number 2, M, number 3. So going back and forth between the letters in I am a great multitasker and the numbers 1 through 20. And again, I can't see you. Typically, I have folks put their pencil down and look up, and I don't have the ability to do that through a webinar. But I'm going to go ahead and give you a countdown again, and I will call out numbers as we move ahead in terms of time. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Go ahead and start here. A back and forth between the letters and the numbers. We're at 15 seconds. We are at 30 seconds, which is where we stopped before. And we're now at 45. So for the sake of continuing to move ahead, I'm going to go ahead and stop our exercise here. I'll tell you that when I do this in person, typically most average anywhere from 40 seconds to a minute for this second part of the exercise. I'd like you to take a look real quick at what you did. Notice if there's any errors or mistakes in the second one, and see if there's anything that you can identify. And then the things to point out that typically occur when I have a discussion after this exercise, many will notice that they had some errors, or maybe they had to start over again, or maybe they had a challenge going back and forth between, the letters and the numbers. And that's actually really good news. I will fess up that the first time I did this exercise, I was at the Mindfulness Conference, meditation conference in Washington, D.C. And I did the first exercise, and about 15 seconds, and I did the second one in about 20. And I put my pencil down and looked around, and I thought I was just the rock star of the room because I was so great at multitasking. Until the presenter went on to explain that those of us that were really, really good or thought we were good at multitasking and were able to go back and forth really quickly have actually trained our brains to be at a point where we need to multitask all the time and our brains aren't actually good at really focusing on one thing. So that's what we're going to start to dive into a lot more. It applies to business from a perspective in terms of concentration. So a little fun exercise that you can play with. Moving forward, what do we do with this? A lot of it has to do with balance. It's a myth. Our brains are not actually designed to be able to multitask, at least not to do it well. We can do things, but we need to do them actually in a sequence. And the downside of this relates into the workforce in terms of efficiency. So what happens when we're multitasking quite a bit hinders innovation and creativity. We already talked about the fact that we aren't bored very often. We don't actually take that time or space. Kills a sense of prioritization. Multitasking also decreases quality. And then another thing is it actually rewires your brain. And I'm a brain junkie. You're going to hear me talk about the brain quite a bit in talking about it. The other thing that is important to understand related to this topic and multitasking is a comment about the way men's brains work and female brains work. And I do not mean this to be a sexist comment in any way. It's actually validated that women are a little bit better at multitasking. But that's actually not something to be celebrated. It's a matter of that we've trained our brains to do it, but there's a downside to it too as well. So something to keep in mind just in terms of how we process information. So 46% of the time your brain is thinking about doing an activity that you aren't doing. That may even be the case right now with the webinar. I mentioned this morning to my fiance that I was giving a webinar today and how I prefer public speaking, and he made the comment to me of, oh, it's not a big deal. People don't pay attention to the webinar anyway. Don't worry about it, which I thought was kind of funny. It wasn't a very supportive comment. I think he meant well by it. But, you know, understanding that the more you pay attention to something, the stronger the prefrontal cortex gets. So in terms of making that connection with the brain. And that leads to better decision making as well. So if you ever feel like you're making snap judgments or quick to decide, you know, and maybe you even celebrate the fact that you're quick to make decisions, realize that you've trained your brain to do that, and it can be a great skill set in cases of chaos or emergency, and we'll talk about fight or flight, but it also trains your brain that it moves really fast in all cases where sometimes maybe it makes more sense to actually slow things down a little bit. So that quick reaction impacts better problem solving, work-life balance, concentration, focus, creativity, and obviously relationships as well. There's an old saying in neuroscience that neurons that fire together, wire together, and that goes to that whole practice makes perfect. So maybe you played an instrument as a child and you heard that practice makes perfect speech and know that it is true. So that's what we're talking about when we study neuroscience and how it relates to mindfulness as well. So the ability to learn about something is building and strengthening that neural connection. It's also important to understand what does that mean in terms of unlearning or breaking down the old ones. And that is called synaptic pruning. So sharing a little bit about how that works for you. Picture of our brain here. So you grow these connections between the neurons, and then the connections, the neurotransmitters act like dopamine, serotonin, they travel across the brain. There's also these G cells, glial cells, which act to speed up signals between the neurons. And then other cells are the waste removers, and they prune your connections. So what does that really mean? Question is which ones to prune. Which ones do we actually get rid of? And this is where the mindfulness part comes in. So researchers the last couple of years have spent a lot of time and made some great discoveries about a protein called the C1q. And the C1q is a protein that actually helps mark in your brain the thoughts that you don't access much. So where this is really important from a business setting, from a personal relationship setting, is if you continue to go, for example, to a negative thought, I'm not good, I'm going to fail, it's not going to work. You build those neurons, no different than learning to play the piano. You build those connections in your brain, they get stronger, the brain accesses them quicker. The happier thoughts, the supportive thoughts, maybe I'm good, I'm going to excel, I'm going to do a good job of this. If your brain isn't actually thinking those things or making those connections, they get deleted at night as part of that pruning process with that protein. They get marked with that C1q. So it's a really fascinating discovery the last couple of years, and it ties to our mindfulness discussion. Also relates to if you feel like your brain is full. I know kids sometimes say that. Maybe you feel that way if you have a new job or you're in a project. And I think we have this concept that, your brain really can't be full. Well, it actually can. When we learn new things, we actually have to make way in our brain for other things and then help build those connections. So the key takeaway with the brain is the importance of the connections you are making. So the things that you are practicing, whether it's good thoughts, happy thoughts, good conversations, you're making those neural pathways, those are what stay, and we are quicker to actually access them from a brain standpoint as opposed to ones that are deleted. And that process actually happens during our sleep at night. So when we sleep, brain cleans itself out. That's why sleep is so very important, in addition to other reasons that sleep's so important for just our body and our health and restoration. But your brain cells shrink up to about 60% to create space for that C1 protein, that glial gardeners to come in and prune those synapses. So if you've ever woken up from a good night's sleep and maybe felt rested, or maybe there was a problem or a disagreement you had with a spouse or a friend or a problem at work, and you woke up the next day and things seemed a little clearer, well, that's that process happening and working, which is actually a really wonderful thing that our brain has that capability. On the same token, when we have a sleep-deprived brain, or a brain that's too full, or a brain in which we're accessing negative thoughts all the time, it's really, really hard and sluggish to have good, positive decision making. You can see the analogy here. It's overgrown, it's slow going, and it's exhausting. So the great news of all of this is we actually have some control over what our brain decides to delete when we sleep. Again, going back to what we are mindful about actually allows us to help control this process quite a bit. And we're going to go ahead and launch our next poll here. Does your mind ever get ahead of itself and create stories? So I've got some examples in here. If you're in a fight with someone at work and you devote time to thinking about how to get to them and not about the project. So Tony, go ahead and launch this next poll. Does your mind ever get ahead of itself and create stories? We'll go ahead and close it now. So I've got 90% of you said yes, 10% said nope, which is fantastic. You're in a really, really healthy state of mind. The example that I like to use related to this is, maybe you've got an upcoming family event such as Thanksgiving, and if you've ever played out in your mind what's already going to happen. Your sister-in-law is going to say this, mother-in-law is going to say this situation's going to happen. That's a really great example of what you're doing with your brain in many ways, creating these conversations, playing out what the future looks like. So how does all of this relate to business? Well, the example I just gave you relates to business very much too. We play out things in our head all the time, create stories of where things are going to go. And it's a real challenge because the other factors we have in today's marketplace is just the changing landscape of business. We face a range of fast-paced and ever-changing challenges, and I think all of us can say that in many cases in our business world, we are tasked with making decisions in a stressed and unstable environment. So feelings of uncertainty can also lead to undermining decisions, and we know that this is a costly endeavor for the United States, just looking at it in particular. Cost of stress in the workplace is estimated at about $300 billion a year in the United States, and it's a focus of many HR programs and professionals at this time. So how do we solve it? Two ideas here. One is to remedy the underlying mechanisms that lead to stress in the first place, which is easier said than done. But in many cases, there's ways that we can actually control our own stress and help with intervention. And that's where meditation and mindfulness can come into play in this discussion. So discussing mindfulness is a topic of business circle these days. Why and what exactly does it mean? It's garnered a lot of attention in the last decade because of all of the factors we've already talked about. The lack of creativity, the challenge of multitasking, the lack of brainstorming, of being bored. All of those have factors in terms of how we are acting as individual components and as companies and organizations itself, and the importance of actually addressing these things. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, is a term that is used quite a bit, and it's a concept that has grown quite a bit, starting out in the psychology circles, but it has moved into schools as well as our corporate world as well. There are MBSR programs right now throughout many, many companies. Google has a program for its staff. Many schools are incorporating yoga, meditation, mindfulness programs, and then even Congress has a program, and I won't make any political comments as to whether or not it's working, but they recognize the importance for all the things that we just talked about with regard to better decision making and looking at things. So meditation and mindfulness can seem a little woo-woo in many circles when we start to talk about it. It can be very misunderstood in many cases. And one of the things that I think is really important to understand is though it has roots in Eastern philosophies such as Taoism and Buddhism, it has the ability to actually be applied in business sectors and educational sectors as well, from mindfulness as well as a meditation standpoint. I think one of the key misconceptions is that it's a religious practice. And it certainly can be. Meditation is something that could be incorporated into your particular religion or beliefs, whatever they may be, but it certainly doesn't have to be. Same with yoga, trying to understand and acknowledge that, that what we are talking about here today is not rooted in any sort of religion or any sort of dogma in any way. A lot of our insurance companies, health agencies, hospitals, et cetera, are incorporating not only for their staff MBSR programs, but for patients. What does it look like to help them with meditation before surgery or after? What does that look like in terms of helping them with controlling and working on their breathing, et cetera? So we're seeing it in many, many circles. The benefits: avoiding burnout, managing stress, enhancing leadership capacity. As you can well imagine, if we have the ability to control our thoughts a little bit better and how we interact with others, makes us better leaders. Steady minds, we're in the midst of making important business decisions, career transitions, personal life changes, but it simply goes beyond the stress aspect, but to also how it impacts our body and those around us. So mindfulness is being fully aware of what is happening in the present. So instead of mulling over the past, oh gee, I should have never sent that email, or worrying about the future, I know I won't get that promotion, really being able to actually take control of what some of those thoughts are and redirect the mind. In psychology circles, it's often called face and replace. So instead of mulling over these situations, how could you face that situation and replace it with a different outcome or with different verbiage? So mindfulness involves stilling the chatter and focusing on the here and now. And one simple exercise to play with, and it's something that we were tasked with when we were learning meditation and mindfulness in yoga teacher training school, was to take a simple activity such as washing dishes and to be very mindful about it. As silly as it sounds, but to observe what it feels like to have the warm water and as it cools down, what that feels like on your hands. To actually feel what the suds are like, to actually, be mindful about scrubbing the dish. That may sound very painful for you, but it's something to play with in terms of just stopping the chatter and playing with being present with the here and the now. So mindful or mindful, and I've always really liked this graphic. I got a puppy a couple of years ago, and he taught me quite a bit about being mindful, because when I would take him on walks, I was guilty of having my phone out in many cases, trying to multitask. And he got to the point where he would actually stop dead in his tracks and look up at me if I didn't put the phone down, which I thought was a really great lesson for me to go ahead and look around, and a lot we can learn from kids and our pets. So mindfulness is not overthinking or overanalyzing, but it's also not banishing the thoughts. And that's one of the things I hear quite a bit from those that want to experiment or maybe have tried meditation before. I hear that, I sat down on a pillow and I crossed my legs and I tried to banish all my thoughts and clear my mind, and it didn't work. And you're right, I'm sure it probably didn't. There's a big misconception in terms of being mindful and to playing with meditation that you're supposed to release all the thoughts. It's not possible. We've just talked about the brain and how it works. Our brain is designed to have thoughts and to think things. So meditation and mindfulness is really learning to understand when those thoughts come in, how to channel them, how to move them in a different direction, how to play with them, how to, again, face and replace. So it's both a process as well as an outcome. Another thing to understand just in terms of how the brain works is mindfulness with regard to the fight or flight syndrome. So this is something you probably learned in 7th or 8th grade in your biology class. And so just a quick reminder, our fight or flight system is designed in all of us as human beings. We were designed to live in caves, to run away from tigers, to run away from bears. Our body does not know that we live in different systems now, that we aren't running from tigers and bears in most cases, but we are designed to have that same stress response. So whether we, have a stressful email from somebody or we're actually running away from our tiger, our body actually releases that same cortisol, that chemical response that allows us to move into our fight or flight system. And what that means is our body actually shuts down our digestive system, and it moves us into a very quick decision-making process. So if you think about it, if you're running away from danger, you don't want to have to go to the bathroom. You need to be able to move fast. It actually pumps adrenaline to our muscles, and we want to be able to make quick decisions. So that is our fight or flight system. Challenge we have in today's society is that stress response happens, and when that cortisol is released into our body, unless we do something to actually remove it, whether through mindfulness, some type of exercise, etc., that cortisol lives within our body for about 48 hours. So if you think of the number of times where you have a stress response during a given day, you can think of the cortisol that's running through your body and not actually, moving you a different direction. It's why we have so many challenges right now with digestive issues. It's a leading cause of obesity as well, because that cortisol is actually stored as fat in the stomach area. So all of these things impact, and again, it's important to understand how the brain works. So people that practice mindfulness can actually change the structure of the brains and help us get out of that fight or flight mode. Can be the difference between freaking out and keeping cool. So body-wise, the more mindful you are, the more dominant your relaxation response becomes as well. So not pushing you into fight or flight mode from an email. I've heard stories of people that they know that their stress response kicks in when they see somebody's name show up on their screen on their phone through caller ID. So if you think again of the number of times we push ourselves into that stress response. What happens to our bodies, I already mentioned how our body changes so we can run away from the tigers and the bears, but our blood pressure changes, heart rate, inflammation. Meditation can help fight that, in terms of chronic fatigue, irritable bowel syndrome I mentioned to you as well. So all of these things really are adding up, and if we're able to control our mind's response to things, it helps our body's response to it as well. So how do we put all of this in practice? I've talked quite a bit about the brain. Hopefully you've learned some things there, you know, and how do you then actually move from this webinar and try to do something? Well, the first thing I'd invite you to do is really just have some awareness of some of the things that we've talked about. Do you notice when you have a stress response? Do you notice when you're going into fight or flight? And Tony, I'll go ahead and let you launch that one. Last poll we're going to do you have a good sense of when your body is entering fight or flight? We'll go ahead and close the poll here. The majority of you said, 72% said, yes, I can feel, which is great. The fact that you can feel when you are entering into stress response gives you the ability to actually respond accordingly and make some changes in terms of controlling your mind. So one thing I'd invite you to play with to start is starting out with a 5-minute exercise where you close your eyes, try to focus on your breath, and then maybe count how many times the mind wanders. 5 minutes may seem like an eternity, so maybe you start with 1. There's a lot of great apps out there. Insight Timer is one that I would recommend. There's several other. And I'm actually pulling up an article that I found just a week ago. There's currently 500 apps right now in Apple's App Store and Google Play related to Buddhism in terms of mindfulness. So there's a ton out there. The Insight Timer is actually a really great one, though, and it's free and allows you to set a timer. There's all sorts of also guided meditations, too, which is a great way to go ahead and start. And again, I challenge you not to get frustrated. You sit down that first day, and no, you don't have to sit with your legs crossed and sit on a pillow. You do want to be in a space that's free of distractions, though. Sit down for a minute with an app, with a timer, and try and just focus on your breathing, maybe counting the inhales and the exhales, seeing if you can match them and slow it down. That alone for a minute has great benefits to your body in terms of dealing with the stress response. Great way to start a program. Next thing is to be here and to be now, bring that present awareness. So we talked a little bit about the exercise of washing dishes, or maybe taking the dog on a walk, putting the phone away and looking around. Maybe challenge yourself when you're out holiday shopping to look around or smile at others and just get back to maybe how we used to function a little bit better in society. But in terms of the office, maybe notice the smell of the coffee maker, pause and look around, sit in a different place in a meeting, walk a different way to your desk. Right, today in Michigan, it's actually really, really beautiful. We've got several inches of snow on the ground, and it's really pretty to look outside and see this winter wonderland. So take advantage of, you know, pausing and look at things just a little bit differently. And then the other thing, especially since so many of you have a really good awareness with regard to when you are moving into that stress response, is to stop the conversations mulling in your head and to take a couple of minutes, maybe before a meeting, and get yourself in a really good space. So if you have a 1 o'clock meeting, don't rush right in there. Don't rush in there telling yourself the stories. Maybe close your door for a couple of minutes beforehand and stop and breathe. If we think about our kids when they're upset and they come to us and they're, you know, so upset and they're trying to catch their breath, and what do? First thing we do is we tell them to slow down and we tell them to breathe. Well, as adults, we exhibit the same behavior. It looks a little bit different, as we usually don't have tears running down our face. But if we can stop and actually take a couple of breaths, there's great benefits in terms of slowing down the heart rate, getting our body out of that fight or flight response, and then really working on reprogramming our brain in terms of the thoughts that we are, you know, creating those neurons together. So a final slide for all of you. Life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans. A great quote from John Lennon. I appreciate all of you joining today. I am going to open it up to questions if Tony has any that are coming in. And I also invite you to follow up afterwards with any questions, or even if you're struggling trying to figure out how to take the next steps with this in your life or with your organization. Tony, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you so much for this interesting presentation, Kimberly. Let's give our participants a couple of seconds to enter the chat, type some of the questions they have in the chat box, as we mentioned at the beginning. We have a couple of questions here for you, Kimberly. The first one that I see here is, how do I convince my boss that corporate mindfulness is something we should talk about?
Great question. I think, again, this topic can seem a little woo-woo in some cases. I think one of the things that's important is actually to bring it up from a standpoint of science and facts. So maybe not go into all the details that I did today about the brain, but there are a lot of studies, and I'd be happy to pass them along or help you find them from an HR perspective in terms of employee productivity, group work, groupthink, the benefits of brainstorming, the benefits of creativity, if we have a more mindful approach to things. So, depending on your work situation and how your particular supervisor maybe looks at things or your HR team, I think a great way to do it is to come up from a perspective of the facts and the science that we now have available.
Thank you, Kimberly. We have another question. How can you develop more mindfulness while you're feeling constantly rushed?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I think one of the things, and what I'm about to say is probably things that you've heard before, but it took me several years before I actually put them into practice, and I know it made a difference. Really trying to slow down and maybe try not to do so many things at once. One of the tips that I give people is to close your email, maybe for a certain time or a certain set of hours a day, especially if you're working on a project that really should require all of your attention. Maybe closing your door, or if you're in an open office environment, maybe you need to schedule a conference room so you can really try and give yourself a little bit of seclusion to really focus on things, to be a little bit more mindful about what you're doing. Also, to schedule extra time, as silly as it sounds, schedule that extra half an hour during the day, give yourself a little bit more padded time. I know in the past I've been guilty of trying to do too much at once, and I feel like I'm rushing from thing to thing, or I'm always dangerously close to being late to something throughout the day, and I know I'm not at my best when I'm operating in that kind of environment. So I don't think those are probably new ideas. I'm sure you've heard them before. I can tell you, though, that they've made a difference for me as well as many others if you just play with them and put them into practice. Great question.
The next question is if you have any recommendations on how to limit multitasking during a typical workday.
Great question. So building on what we just talked about, and I'll share a little dirty laundry on myself. I realized I had a huge problem with multitasking when I would find myself, on conference calls, leading conference calls, while I was responding to emails and maybe checking my phone at the same time. So that again goes back to how our brains are programmed. I had trained my brain that it needed to have many different areas of input all at the same time. And one way to know if you're guilty of this is to answer the question of whether or not you are capable of sitting at home watching TV without having your phone in your lap, or you do have to scroll Facebook while you do it. Chances are then that your brain is craving many sources of input. So how do you handle that in a work environment? I would really encourage you again to try and block things off. I know that may seem foreign to many of you in terms of your work style because you've gotten really good at going from thing to thing, but see if you can block things out a little bit better. Also having a really good sense of what maybe has to be done this afternoon versus tomorrow morning. I know in my case, and this doesn't necessarily apply to everybody, but there are tasks, especially creativity tasks, writing tasks, that I can knock out really quickly in the morning if I'm fresh and I've had that good night's sleep, and it's going to take me 3 times as long in the afternoon. So find your own story that relates to that example. It may not be writing, it may be a different time set, but when are you at your best in terms of creativity, and then how can you limit the multitasking around it? And it's not easy. What I'm describing I know is really challenging, but so don't try and tackle everything at once. Maybe take one small area that you can focus on and try and make some changes.
Well, we don't have any more questions. Thank you again, Kimberly.
Thank you.
And also thanks to all our participants for joining us today. Please remember to fill out the brief feedback survey that you will see as we exit the webinar. And that concludes today's webinar presentation. We hope you enjoyed it.